When people hear the words colonialism and imperialism, they automatically think about Britain, Spain, and France. Please provide examples of American colonialism in the 20th and 21st centuries.
Sure, absolutely. So what happened is, particularly the most monumental historic event, I would say, was World War II. World War II, and of course, it's not really a world war. It's a European war that ended up involving the entire world. Because Africans, had no beef with the issues that they were arguing over, in Europe. Many Africans didn't know who Adolf Hitler was, who Mussolini was, right? But they became involved because they recruited hundreds of thousands of Africans that didn't even know where they were being taken to fight on behalf of those colonial powers, right? So Britain took hundreds of thousands of people to fight in the British Army in Europe, in the Far East, and France did the same thing, right? So at the end of that war, Europe was exhausted. The economies had collapsed, been destroyed. So Europe, in fact, during the war itself, throughout the colonial period, Africa had been sustaining Europe, but even much so during the war itself, when Europe, in order to feed itself, had to get food from African countries. That's how Europe was feeding itself and financing its wars. But at the end of World War II, exhausted, they could no longer afford to maintain their African colonies because their economies had been completely destroyed. Europe and Europeans would be in the same condition that most African countries are in today, had it not been for the United States, with what is called the Marshall Plan, gave European countries billions of dollars in grants to repair their economy. Not a loan, but grants that they didn't even have to pay back. So now, what is going to be done with these African countries that are now winning their independence? And in fact, some people who read the political scene of the day, Africans coming into leadership, realizing that Europe has now been weakened, thought that they might actually be able to enjoy true independence. But it started off from the very beginning, very early, where you could tell that they were not going to enjoy true independence. Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, was the first major testing ground. Congo elected Patrice Lumumba, Pan-African nationalist, supported by Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, as his first leader, independently elected, democratically elected, in June 1960. By September, he had been overthrown because the Belgians didn't want to leave. And what was he demanding? He was demanding that they change these contracts that took all the profits. At that time, coltan was not yet the big thing. It was copper, and copper is still a big thing today, by the way. Said, let's renegotiate these contracts so that we can also get a fair share and use the money to also build up our country. We're supposed to be independent, and yet we're still controlling our major commodity, which is copper. And of course, they didn't want that to end. So they undermined this government, and the United States sided with fellow imperialists, the Belgians and the British. The CIA was involved. Ultimately, Lumumba was killed in the most brutal way in January 1961. They wanted to wipe out his whole memory. It's quite, and they call Africans the barbarians, but this is what they did. After he was killed by a firing squad, they chopped up his body into pieces, and then they burned the body, and then they crushed the bones into powder, and then they dissolved it in sulfuric acid, and they kept a teeth. The Belgian police commander, who was supervising this gruesome killing, a tooth and another body part. And this tooth was just returned last year in a major ceremony reported as the return of the remains of Patrice Lumumba. It was that one tooth. So this was the first instance of the United States displaying its neo-colonial imperialism on the African continent. Nkrumah was really brilliant. Nkrumah wrote a book called Neo-Colonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. I highly, highly recommend that book. If people don't have the time to read that book, just go online and Google it, and you'll be able to read the introduction. If you read the introduction of that book and you don't order it, then you're not serious about Africa, because he breaks it down. And he says, listen, they wanted our resources before we became independent. So why should they not continue to want it after independence? So what are they going to do? They're going to sponsor reactionary African leaders to undermine others who are talking about us uniting. But he said, the United States of Africa is the only way we'll be strong enough to enjoy real independence and to protect our minerals and to say, this is the price we want for it, and you must give it to us. And we have the army to support that. So the United States realized that this guy, Nkrumah, is an enemy of colonialism and neo-colonialism, right? And first of all, when the book was published in 1965, they withdrew $250 million that they were going to send to Ghana in financial aid. Actually, I think it was 25 million at the time. But if you magnify the value today, yeah, it would be more than 250 million, maybe even 300 million. So they withdrew that, took that off the table. And they wrote an official letter of protest, protesting against a book written by an African president. That book has the formula for African liberation. And they also worked to get rid of Nkrumah. There's something called the archival history of the State Department. And I say this because it's something you can actually Google, and it'll take you to the website of the State Department, where they have these archival documents, and you can read the memos that they were writing. It's right there online. The State Department writing memos to the World Bank saying, okay, you loaned some money to Ghana. Even though the loan is approved, don't send them the money, actually. Don't disburse the money. Because if you do that, then the economy is going to weaken, and then Ghanaians are going to start protesting against Nkrumah, and then the military and the police is going to overthrow him. The memo was written in 1965. 1966, he was overthrown. So other African leaders started seeing what was happening to African leaders who wanted to exert true independence. And then that's when the Africans who were willing to step forward stopped stepping forward. You started having reactionary African leaders, to the extent that when Donald Trump said Africa and Haiti, he said Haiti and Africa, collection of shithole countries, the most reactionary of these African leaders, who is General Yoweri Museveni of Uganda, said, I love Donald Trump. And people think this is too preposterous. Google it and you will read it for yourself. It was widely reported by all the major media. And he's a person that's been a very brutal dictator that's been in power for 37 years, fully backed by the West, by the World Bank, by the IMF. Go back to Congo. When they killed Patrice Lumumba, the person they put to succeed him was General Mobutu, the most corrupt of the corrupt African leaders. Stole $5 billion, drove his economy to the ground. Every time there was an uprising by Africans who wanted to get rid of this Western puppet, the West would send support to Mobutu. They would send weapons, they would send planes, and then Moroccan soldiers would go to help Mobutu to fight the war and stay in power. Mobutu was in power for 37 years, backed by the West. And now you have the other person, Museveni, who says, I love Donald Trump, not by accident, that he's also been in power 37 years back there with the West. And that is the contemporary manifestation of U.S. imperialism in Africa. And then you saw another recent example, of course, in Libya. Libya was completely destroyed, saying they were going in to stop Muammar Gaddafi from, quote, killing his own people. That's what they said. So how are you going to stop him from, quote unquote, killing his own people? Bombing Libya 24/7 for almost 8 months. And who knows how many Libyans were killed by NATO and the United States from that attack. How much infrastructure was destroyed. There's not been a single story in the Western corporate media. Nobody will take any accounting for what they did to Libya. And then had Gaddafi brutally killed, sodomized with a bayonet, and then brutally killed, his body displayed in a refrigerator. And they saw this. In fact, one of the most preposterous images that came out of this was Hillary Clinton, who was then Secretary of State under President Obama. She rushed to Libya and posed for a photograph with the people that they helped install in powers. The New York Times were calling them as, I forget the term, whether it's like liberators or some nonsense like that, right? So she posed with them. I think she had like the V sign, right? Because she's hoping this is going to help her when she runs for president down the line, that I helped bring Gaddafi down. I was tough on Gaddafi. Of course, she never used that. Why? Because Libya has now been pushed back to the 18th century. It's a non-country. Libya had one of the highest per capita incomes in the world. Libya had free education, free housing, free healthcare. When people got married, they would get a marriage grant so they can start off their life. Think about that. Which country has that? Not even the United States. And now look what they have in Libya today.